Hi, my name is Mike Duran. I'm a senior fellow here at the Hudson Institute, and this is an event on Saudi Arabia and the new Middle East. There have been an enormous number of significant events in recent weeks, events that I believe are changing the balance of power in the region. And we've invited two extremely experienced and knowledgeable guests to discuss these changes with us. On my right is Professor Bيرني Heykel from the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. He's an expert on the Middle East in general and has a special expertise on Yemen. Welcome, Bيرني. And on my left is Mohammed al-Yahya. This is his inaugural event as a visiting fellow here at the Hudson Institute. Mohammed is formerly the English language editor of Al-Arabiyya. And he is a Saudi national, and he is also a very astute student of the Middle East. And Mohammed, since this is an event on Saudi Arabia, perhaps I'll start with you. And let me just ask you, one of the most striking things that's happened the last few weeks is the restart of the negotiations in Vienna on the JCPOA. Why don't you give us a sense of how Riyadh is reading the negotiations?
Thanks, Mike. I think the apprehensions that not only Riyadh but other Gulf states have this time around are the same as they had in 2015, albeit maybe a little sharper. Because the region really witnessed what an empowered Iran looked like for the region, in Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and in Yemen. We did see that the GCC did endorse a document or put forth a document where they supported the idea of reaching a new deal with Iran. But that, again, is a parallel to what happened in 2015. There was a feeling in the region and in the Gulf in particular that those countries were left out of a security agreement that touches their own national security very closely.
So that the United States is negotiating with the Iranians over the head of its regional allies.
Precisely. So the idea is that the Iranian threat is multifaceted. It's a nuclear threat, that's for sure, but also ballistic missiles are a threat. Militias across the region and proxies that Iran has are also a threat. And none of the countries that are within range of Iran's ballistic missiles were included in an agreement that flushed the regime with cash and allowed it to rapidly expand its proxy network across the region. So today we're seeing the same thing. And it's important to note that for many of these countries, the United States is a very valuable ally. If the United States wants you on board publicly with any of its initiatives, you publicly endorse that initiative. That doesn't really change that there is real worry and there is real apprehension in private. And I'm sure that officials in the Gulf are making that worry very clear and communicating that to the administration today, just as they did in 2015.
So you are. I mean, I think for somebody like me, what you're saying makes a lot of sense, which is that the effort to find a deal with Iran is actually empowering Iran. But of course, a lot of people are presenting this as it's actually constraining Iran in some way.
Yeah, no, I mean, the view in the region, I think, is that it is empowering Iran, and I think, in fact, it did empower Iran.
And empowering Iran across the board,
course,
not just in the nuclear.
See, the thing is, there's a very popular diagnosis of the region in which Iranian expansion in the region is painted as a sort of cost-effective, efficient, cheap expansion across the region, whereas the multi-billion-dollar defense budgets of Gulf countries are cost much more. The reality is there are over 100 Shia militias in the region that are funded, cultivated, supported by Iran, and that adds up. And Iran needs US dollars in order to maintain those militias. And sanctions deprived the regime of those US dollars that it needed. So that's why in the past few years, We saw, for example, Hezbollah call on the party faithful to donate to them. We've seen, in addition, of course, to the elimination of Qasem Soleimani, the fact that there wasn't much money around caused a lot of discord within the ranks of Iraqi militias. There was suffering in Syria in that regard, and to some extent in Yemen as well. So I think the view in the region is that if the JCPOA were to be brought back as it was, first of all, the sunset clauses are just around the corner, so it's a clear path to give Iran a nuclear weapon. It's kicking the can down the road, but I think more importantly, 4 countries in the region, it means that the Revolutionary Guards will be empowered to go on overdrive and reestablish that hold over their proxies that was diminished to a large degree by the elimination of Qasem Soleimani.
So you mentioned this GCC statement in support of the nuclear deal. If what you're saying is true, if this is causing alarm in Riyadh, and I have no doubt that it is, but why isn't Mohammed bin Salman standing up and screaming it from the rooftops that this is a betrayal by the United States of its allies, that they're empowering the worst elements in the Middle East?
Because this is the second rodeo. I mean, this happened under the Obama administration. So I think there's a perception in the region and in fact here in Washington among a lot of people that follow this stuff, that this realignment away from traditional allies in the region, this reimagining of what the American security order in the Middle East looks like is underway. So what several Gulf countries and several Arab countries are doing is trying to hedge their bets. They're trying to deal with that reality on the ground. And if this was the first time, then maybe you'd see more public denouncement. But it's like a movie that you've seen again. Mm-hmm. You know exactly how it's going to play out. You know where the supporters of that sort of policy will not budge.
So they know ahead of time that they're not going to get a hearing in Washington, and if they raise their voice, they're just going to annoy Washington. So they just deal with the reality that's created without really trying to fight it in Washington.
I think that's a fair characterization. And then also, I mean, this has been made clear by the Biden administration that the strategic priority, as they see it for the United States, is to shift focus a little bit away from the Middle East in order to counter the China threat. Which that's another.
I'll come back to you on China in a little bit. But Professor Heykel, Mohammed is saying that there's a realignment with Iran, not just with regard to the JCPOA, but across the region. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about what that means in Yemen. First of all, do you see it that way yourself, and what does it mean in Yemen, where there's an Iranian proxy, the Houthis, who are operating against the Saudis?
Yeah, so I definitely do see that the signals, and those signals go back well over a decade now, that the U.S. is reorienting itself, and that traditional allies are not the key levers for American influence in the region. And what Muhammad said, which is that the actors in the region are hedging. So in the case of a country like Saudi Arabia, but also the UAE and others, what hedging means is to think differently, or to begin to think differently about China. What can China's role be in the region? And as you know, the Chinese are already present in Djibouti. They help with maintaining security against piracy.
Djibouti, which is 25 miles from the Yemen coast.
That's right, on the other side of the Horn.
Technically a base in Africa,
yes,
but in the Middle East.
Yeah, very much in the Middle East. I think there is, the Russians are present, and the Russians have shown themselves to be effective both in Syria and to some extent in Libya with the Wagner Group. So the other element for Saudi Arabia in particular, and in other GCC countries, is oil, is how they think about the production of oil. That's a complicated set of issues, it's not just about politics. It has kind of economic and developmental and diversification dimensions to it. But the Saudis, for instance, when asked by the Biden administration to increase production recently, did not do so. So I think that's part of, one of the elements of the unraveling, if you like, of the relationship, or of the hedging that you see. Now, with respect to Yemen, what we have...
Sorry, just to make sure that I'm clear, that one of the elements of the unraveling is that the Saudis are no longer cooperating with the Americans with regard to oil prices, whereas traditionally that was an area where we had a lot of give and take. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, basically what happened, to be quite specific, for a couple of reasons. One, because of the global economy was now coming back after, despite COVID, and also because of the various Western and American policies on limiting exploration development in the United States. Prices of oil were rising, and so the Americans asked the Saudis to increase production, very bluntly asked them to bring the price of oil down. It's a global commodity, and it's fungible, and it's priced globally. And the Saudis said, no, we're not going to do that. Now, most recently, which is literally yesterday, the Saudis did agree to increase production by 400,000 barrels, which was something that was already pre-agreed to with what is called OPEC+. That's a new, again, another feature of the changing global order is that the Saudis are now coordinating with the Russians on oil production. That was something that was not the case before. So, there are all these little signs that, for me, are a clear vector that of the decline in American influence globally, but in particular in the region. And I'm not sure how having a deal with Iran can somehow fix that, right? In fact, it seems to me that it would accelerate the decline of American influence. Now, should I turn to Yemen?
Yeah, but as long as we're, I do want to get to Yemen, but as long as we're on this subject, since you raised this question of decline of American influence, do you see this as a sort of inevitable structural change, or is, as Charles Krauthammer famously wrote a few years ago, decline is a choice? Is this a choice that the United States has made to relinquish elements of the Middle Eastern system to others, or is this just something that they can't, that there's no choice about?
I mean, it is a choice, and it's also a choice that is premised on a couple of very faulty assumptions. So, the American administration now is obsessively focused on China as the new enemy, and that we have a new Cold War, and that somehow the Middle East is a distraction in that Cold War. So here's the faulty premise. If you really want to have China over a barrel, forgive the pun, you actually need to have control over Middle East maritime shipping and oil flows.
Some 60% of China's energy consumption is from imported sources, which either originate in or transit through the Middle East.
Correct.
So as long as we're the dominant power there, we have them over a barrel.
Exactly.
Right.
So I don't see how diminishing your footprint in the Middle East, or signaling that you're not interested in the Middle East, which is actually what is being signaled, helps you confront China. It has the opposite effect, and it in fact brings China into the Middle East, which is what you don't want to have happen.
How does it bring China into the Middle East?
Well, the hedging that Muhammad was saying, the local actors will start saying, okay, in Yemen, for instance, we're having problems potentially with maritime shipping through the Bab el-Mandeb, which is the strait at the bottom of the Red Sea that goes up to Suez and then to the Mediterranean. So if you...
So the corridor through which oil is either coming out of the Middle East and going to Europe, or...
And 15% of all global trade goes through that strait. And if you remember when that one big container ship got stuck in the Suez Canal, we felt it, right? So maintaining security and safety and the free flow of shipping through that strait is extremely important. Now, if the Houthis say take over Yemen and decide that they're going to
25 miles from the Djibouti base. Of
exactly. What will the Saudis say? The Saudis will no doubt say to the Chinese, but also to the Europeans and the Russians and others, we need you to help us keep this place secure. That's not a role that any of them have ever had. That has been always an American priority and privilege. And that is why, the United States has a security umbrella in the region. So we're seeing that unraveling.
And you think it's no accident that the Chinese put a base in Djibouti, which is on the Bab el-Mandeb Straits?
Absolutely.
They're thinking in this direction.
Absolutely.
They don't have the military forces at this point in time
That's right.
to actually be the major guarantor, but they're looking forward to a time when they could be the
And they're looking forward also, when it comes to China, their view of shipping and trade is very different from the American one. So America wants, the free flow of goods, the capitalist system of commerce, which is that America doesn't care where the oil goes to, as long as it's going and it's being sold and it's being traded freely, right? The Chinese have a very different attitude when it comes to commodities, whether from Africa or the Middle East. They want to capture them in what is called a mercantilist form of trade, namely to bring them to China, not to have them flow to other countries. So it's a radically different idea of how trade flows in the world if the Chinese get control of it.
Let me, I do want to get back to you on Yemen in particular, but let me give Mohammed an opportunity to come in on this.
Sure.
I don't know if you have any reactions to what Bernier's been saying.
I think Berney hit the nail on the head. With the current administration, the idea is to free up resources from the Middle East in order to counter China, in order to compete with China. And I think the idea in China is to allocate more resources to the Middle East in order to compete with the United States. So these are two ideas that are at odds with each other. And also, if you look at the idea of sharing the region with Iran, of finding this sort of equilibrium where Iran is no longer feeling threatened, that it comes out from the cold, what you'll have is a situation where, and if the United States does, take its withdrawal, quote unquote, from the region to another level, you will need a security guarantor in the region. And this is not something probably that will happen in the next 4 years or the next 8 years, but this is something this is the natural progression to the idea that the region needs to be left alone, and that the US-led security order in the region is a project that's no longer worth pursuing. What will happen is, I think, is that the Chinese will take advantage of this, and they'll take advantage of this, and also Saudi Arabia will take advantage of it, and Iran will take advantage of it. At the end of the day, China is Saudi Arabia's largest trade partner and the largest buyer of Saudi oil. That gives Saudi Arabia leverage over China, and that gives also China leverage over Saudi Arabia and other states in the Middle East. But what changes the equation is the amount of leverage that China has over Iran, and that is leverage that the United States doesn't have. China is the largest buyer of Iranian oil and the largest trade partner of Iran.
And of course, they recently signed a 25-year agreement by which they'll trade Iranian oil for Chinese investment, and as well as support for security and the security and intelligence sector in Iran.
Right. So if we look at analysis of the Yemen war here in Washington since it began, there's a lot of virtue signaling. There's a lot of focus on various aspects of the war, but markedly absent is the importance of Bab el-Mandeb that Berney mentioned. And I don't think that this is absent in the analysis of the Chinese. The idea that there would be a hostile power on Bab el-Mandeb controlling the free flow of oil in the Strait of Hormuz and in Bab el-Mandeb is a problematic idea. They need energy to continue flowing freely. So if there were to be some grand regional bargain, I think in the long term at least, or the medium to long term, the only guarantor of that bargain and the only actor with skin in the game that wants it to succeed would be China.
Okay, so the picture you see that you're putting in front of us is China working with Iran, which is backing the Houthis in Yemen, to create a situation where I mean, you're almost presenting, I'm putting words in your mouth now, you didn't say this, but you're almost presenting the Houthis as a proxy of the Chinese. Or sort of, you don't want to go that far. But you're saying if you're sitting in Beijing and you're looking at this picture, you like what you see with the Houthis. That's not causing you any.
I actually wouldn't go that far. I don't think the Chinese care who's in Yemen. I think they care that Bab al-Mandeb is a choke point that is never choked, and the same with Hormuz. That's a point of disagreement they would have with Iran. I mean, when we're talking about the Houthis, essentially what we're talking about is Iran. Iran calls the shots when it comes to strategic decisions like that.
Okay, let me push a little bit because I did hear something in there, and I knew you didn't want to go as far as to say that they're a proxy, but perhaps it warms the Chinese heart that the element the most aggressive element today in Yemen is anti-American. Is that possible?
I don't think this is raising alarm bells in Beijing. If that's
they're not
super upset that an anti-American force is in Yemen.
It's not disturbing them. What is your view on that? How are they reading it, you think?
Well, I mean, I'm not an expert on China, so I really don't know how. I mean,
that never stops us here.
Yeah.
We have no respect for expertise. So.
So, no, I mean, I think Yemen is an interesting case because it's a very telling case about how Iran operates in the region, right? Namely, you get non-state actors to do your bidding, you hollow out state institutions, and then you pretend that you want these institutions to remain, but you have a veto power over their functioning. So this is what Hezbollah does, for instance, in Lebanon. This is what a number of Shiite militias can do in Iraq. Now, in the case of Yemen, which is a very complicated case, you have a group of people, a minority, that historically was persecuted and discriminated against, that has come to power and has created a militia using a form of an ideology that is partly inspired by the Iranian Revolution, and that has an endless reservoir of young men that it's willing to throw into battle to effectively take over the country, or at least the northern part of the country. So what we're seeing recently, for instance, in this war to take over an important city called Ma'rib in Yemen, is that the Houthis are using human waves of young men.
The war for Ma'rib is going on right now.
Right now.
And the strategic significance of it is?
So it's two or three. First, it's the last big city that is not under Houthi control. It's next to the oil fields and gas fields, the one remaining refinery in Yemen that functions, and it's very close to the Saudi border. Okay, so if the Houthis take over Ma'rib, which looks very much like that will happen, the only thing that's stopping them is coalition air power, namely Saudi air power. If they take over Ma'rib, then they control all of northern Yemen and will then effectively be the most powerful, dominant force in the country. Now, the Houthis are clearly in an alliance with the Iranians. The Iranians have helped them tremendously in any number of ways, through Hezbollah with training. Many of Houthis have gone to Iran and been trained, especially on missiles and drones. They've been taught how to build their own drones. Their media operation is run out of the southern suburb in Beirut, which is Hezbollah territory. They have really become a very formidable power and a very difficult one to dislodge. I'm frankly not clear as to how, what the solution is to them. I think one has to accommodate them at some level, but not allow them.
I sense the possibility of for some disagreement.
But not allow them, for instance, to be a force that can, say, threaten Bab al-Mandeb. And I'm not sure how to do that.
But their slogan is explicitly anti-American.
Yes.
Right?
And anti-Jewish.
And anti-Jewish, anti-Israel.
Yes.
Right? So I haven't heard the Biden administration express any concern about the rise of the Houthis. All in the major statements that I've seen. Now I can't say that I've read every statement. There's repeated expression
Well, I mean,
of
not
concern
only not only
about
is there
humanitarian crisis and concern about the Saudi
Right.
role.
That's right. And in fact,
so
the Biden administration.
So if you're in Washington,
Yeah.
in the White House, looking at the rise
Yeah.
of a group that is an Iranian proxy created, given its military capabilities by Iran, and that says death to America, death to the Jews, death to Israel. Do alarm bells go off or no?
Well, the Biden administration, one of the first things the Biden administration did was to delist the Houthis, because under the Trump administration, they were listed as a terrorist organization. Biden administration removed them from that terror designation list, thinking that it would make them more moderate and more amenable
Did
to...
it work?
No, it did not.
Didn't
They
work?
doubled down.
Oh.
They doubled down on their...
Actually, they marched on Ma'rib 2 days later.
That's right.
And
They
I don't
doubled
think they
down.
would have
Do we,
had
do we
that
need to make more
designation.
concessions to moderate them? How do we do it?
I don't think you can, actually. There's no hope
There's no
of
amount
moderating.
of American concessions that can moderate them?
No.
No?
In fact, they double down every time. They see it as weakness.
So, I'm assuming that I'm going to give our leadership credit that they're not idiots, and they don't believe that concessions from America are going to moderate the Houthis. So, how are they reading this map then?
So my understanding of how the Biden administration is reading the map is as follows. Firstly, you have an element of domestic politics that you have to account for, namely the element in the Democratic Party that sees the main villain in the entire Middle East to be Saudi Arabia and no one else, right? So I think that element in the Democratic Party has influence over the Biden administration. So that's one element. The other element is that they actually don't care whether the Houthis take over. In fact, they think that maybe the Houthis taking over would help, end the war. I think you'll see.
It's true. Victory by your enemy does end the war. It's true.
But it is ultimately, though, a civil war in Yemen. So I don't think the civil war will end. And we will see even more chaos in Yemen, even if we were to acknowledge Houthi victory.
But why do they not care? You're basically saying then that the Americans and the Chinese are reading it the same way. Doesn't matter who rules Yemen. Doesn't matter that an Iranian proxy with precision-guided weaponry, increasing competence in building and launching precision-guided weaponry, is not a problem for the United States.
I'm baffled as to why they don't care. Frankly, I have no answer for that.
But
there's a fundamental difference between what the U.S. can do in that regard and what the Chinese can do. The Chinese have in their toolbox the tools that can exercise leverage over the Iranians and tell them, here are red lines. Bab al-Mandeb has to be protected. Dial it down in Iraq. I mean, they're the largest buyer of Iranian oil. They're the largest trade partner with Iran. That's a lot of leverage that they can exercise over the Iranians that the United States simply does not have.
Right.
So that's where the difference lies. So an American withdrawal and a filling of that vacuum by Russia doesn't really matter. I mean, a lot of people wrote about Russia taking advantage of vacuums left by the Americans, but these are scraps, And again, what I'm saying, I'm not saying that the U.S. security order is going to disappear overnight. I'm just taking what we're hearing from this sort of Obama doctrine to its logical extreme. And if you do take it to that logical extreme,
Obama doctrine being
the idea that pivoting towards Asia, pivoting away from the region, allowing these warring parties that have irrationally fought each other for 1,400 years in the region to just figure their stuff out, looking at the United States as a removed and isolated third party, a neutral arbiter to some irrational struggle between the Shias in Iran and the Sunnis in Saudi Arabia. And it's a problematic idea for many reasons. First of all, the struggle between Saudi Arabia and Iran is not because of sectarianism. Sectarianism is a tool that is used. in that struggle. The reality of the matter is Iran opposes Saudi Arabia because it views Saudi Arabia as an agent of this American imperial order. And I've done several track twos with the Iranians, almost 12. And with one senior Iranian official, I actually posed this idea that if Saudi Arabia were to break ties with the United States, there wouldn't be a problem with Iran anymore. And our Western interlocutors in the room started laughing and saying, well, what do you mean? Of course, there will be a struggle between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And he raised his hand and he said, no, Muhammad is absolutely correct. The only problem we have is that, these Gulf states are agents of this US order in the Middle East that is supportive of Israel, that is threatening Iran. So the problem is essentially one where between this idea of a US order in the Middle East and Iran's vision for that order. What Iran strives to do in the region is upend what it perceives to be a US regional order, not a Saudi regional order.
So from the point of view of Riyadh, just help us understand a little bit about what does a Houthi victory in Yemen, what are the implications for Saudi Arabia?
So there are multiple implications. I mean,
sorry, just because the administration has made a case from the moment it came into power, it has made a case that Saudi Arabia is the cause of the conflict in Yemen, or that Saudi actions are the problematic aspect of the war from the American point of view. And the Saudis should just pull back. I don't know that they've ever said it exactly, but the implication of their statements is Saudi Arabia should just pull out of the war, in the war, and then we can all sleep a little bit more soundly at night. So let's just, for the sake of discussion, let's just say that the Saudis listen to that and say, okay, we're pulling out. What are the implications for Saudi Arabia then? And as Professor Heykel said, the Houthis basically go and win in the sense of take the north, right, all the north.
So I think it's worth noting that the cooperation between the United States and Saudi Arabia today in Yemen is probably unprecedented. They are on the same page. And the number of sorties that you see the Arab coalition, doing in Yemen has, dropped dramatically. There were some attacks on IRGC facilities actually, and near Sana'a airport recently. But the almost daily, bombardment of Houthi positions that we saw in past years doesn't exist anymore. So the idea that you're floating actually is what we're seeing on the ground happening in Yemen today. But to answer your initial question, what happens if there is a full withdrawal, or what happens if just the Houthis are allowed to rule Yemen? I mean, there is an argument to be made to say, just this is a futile war. Allow the Houthis to run Yemen and allow the Iranians to control Yemen and just step back. This is a quagmire. But I think the problem with that argument is that having a failed state on your border is different than choosing to ignore or divest from or disengage with Lebanon. That's one thing. But having a huge border on a huge southern border with Yemen.
You're referring to the Saudi disengagement from Lebanon. The
Saudi
Saudis recently disengaged from Lebanon. They said, "Okay, we're done being involved in your politics."
Precisely. But that's a luxury I don't think that the Saudis have in Yemen.
Because this is a porous border.
This is the poorest border.
There are tribes that cross the border,
it has the highest number of small arms per capita in the world after the United States. So
an unsettled Yemen is an unsettled southern Saudi Arabia.
An unsettled Yemen is an unsettled Mexico for the United States. Yeah. That's the comparison. The other point is Bab al-Mandeb. Hormuz is a huge national security concern for every single Gulf state. If you were to go into a national security meeting anywhere in the Gulf, the security of Strait of Hormuz is one of those top points. Imagine adding the other choke point, as Bيرني mentioned. Bab al-Mandeb that is closed is essentially closing the Suez Canal. Closing the Suez Canal is a very big deal, as we saw with that tanker. So all of these points are what makes giving up on Yemen a problem. And also on a separate level, there is a moral argument to be made that, subjecting people in Sana'a, people under Houthi rule, to Houthi rule is problematic. After the FTO designation was lifted, the reason given by the Biden administration was that this would make it easier legally and procedurally to coordinate with the Houthis to dispense aid. I think it was a couple of months afterwards that there was a Biden administration condemnation of the Houthis for misappropriating aid and selling it to fund their war effort. So, holding these two ideas at once is a little bit of a problem. But
I would, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead, finish your sentence. I'll interrupt you after you finish.
But the true problem with lifting the FTO designation is that it sent the wrong signal inside Yemen. If you were a Yemeni living in Sana'a and you had to withstand Houthi rule there, and it's important to understand exactly how brutal and how ugly that rule is. I mean, there are jails with thousands of women in them. They're accused of prostitution. Executions are commonplace. In some cases, there are prisoners that are executed just because there's not enough food to give them. And what we saw recently, actually, almost right after the lifting of the Houthi designation, is that a young boy, a 16-year-old boy, who was tortured to death, tortured to paralysis, so he couldn't walk, and he was carried into the square along with 12 other people, and he was executed there. So there is a moral imperative in terms of standing in solidarity with these people that live under Houthi rule and live under Houthi rule not by choice. I think what lifting the FTO designation has sent a signal that the U.S. is no longer standing with those people and empowered the Houthis to continue what they were doing.
Do you think it's a valid assumption that Houthi aspirations are limited to Yemen? So that if there was a total Saudi withdrawal, can the Saudis have any confidence that Houthi ambitions don't extend into Saudi Arabia?
Look, I think Houthi aspirations are to a large degree limited to Yemen. And when the Houthis operate outside of Yemen, it's at the behest of the Revolutionary Guards, in the same way that Hezbollah operates outside its borders at the behest of the Revolutionary Guards. Recently, the information minister of Yemen announced that in clashes or operations that were carried out by the Yemeni armed forces, there were Lebanese and Iranian advisors that were killed. So theoretically, there could be a future where Houthi fighters are sent outside Yemen.
But this is exactly how I see it. Is that this is a Yemeni Hezbollah that Iran is building. And Iran built Hezbollah in Lebanon, not simply in order to dominate Lebanon, but also they now have 150,000 rockets and missiles that are aimed at major strategic sites in Israel, in order to deter Israel everywhere in its contest with Iran, and not just Israel. Also, I know we know what Hezbollah has done in Syria. And I lived through all these arguments. When the Israelis pulled out of Lebanon in 2000, we were told by the experts, who we don't believe in, that Hezbollah was a Lebanese militia, that the only reason it was fighting Israel was because Israel was on Lebanese territory. If it got off Lebanese territory, all of the conflict between Hezbollah and Israel would melt away, or at least Hezbollah would have no reason for threatening Israel. None of that, in my mind, was a wise assumption. I think it's a much wiser assumption to look at Hezbollah as an Iranian light infantry division on Israel's border, and it also can be used, as we've seen in the Syrian civil war, to look after Iranian interests in Syria. Why shouldn't I see the Houthis as identical in the Yemen context?
Right. So, I mean,
I'm sorry, and so
Yeah.
we're directed at Saudi Arabia. They have precision-guided weaponry that can hit Riyadh,
Yeah.
right?
No, I mean, there's no question that the Iranians would love for the Houthis to be exactly like Hezbollah, namely, a division of the IRGC. My sense is that I'm not sure the Houthis will behave this way. I suspect what the Houthis will do, because there is no territorial dispute between the two countries. That's been resolved. I suspect what the Houthis will end up doing is the following. So essentially blackmailing Riyadh, saying, if you don't give us so many billions, if you don't give us money, if you don't give us oil, or whatever it is that they want to further entrench themselves and consolidate their rule, we will launch drones and missiles at you, under whatever pretext. That's more likely to be.
So just to be clear, you're saying that my assumption that this is a Yemeni Hezbollah is based on a somewhat false.
I think it's a bit more complicated.
That the IRGC has more direct control over Hezbollah than it has over the Houthis.
I think that's absolutely the case. I mean, for Hezbollah, for instance, to be a fighter, you have to believe in wilayat al-faqih. I mean, there's a doctrinal, theological, as well as organic kind of connection between Hezbollah and Iran. With the Houthis, is a bit more complicated. I'm not saying that it's not there. There is a connection, but it's a bit more complicated in that the Houthis themselves have their own agenda, which is not just about, I mean, in the case of Hezbollah, they can use Israel, they can use the Palestinian question. There are all kinds of arguments, the Shaba farms, for instance, to maintain hostility. I think the Houthis will have to use a different set of arguments to maintain that hostility.
All right, I will alter my analogy a little bit, and I'll say the analogy is really not Tehran, Hezbollah, it's Tehran, Hamas. So yeah. Hamas is a somewhat independent. It's an independent actor of Iran, but it's got a strategic relationship. But the Iranians have also put right next to Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, which they control directly, and that's a way of keeping Hamas honest, because the Iranians can push a button and initiate conflict with Israel should they desire.
Right. And within the Houthis, you have different factions. So maybe there is a faction, in fact,
that
will end up being like the
and they have
Islamic
a talent
Jihad.
for this. They did it in Iraq. They create little splinter groups and that they own. No,
but
shouldn't we be worried about this?
I think there's a difference between Hamas and the Houthis in that the button to start a conflict with Israel is Hamas's button. Hamas lets Iran press it when Iran wants to press it, but the button in Yemen is in Iran's hand. Iran doesn't give people ballistic missiles and say, this is a gift and use it. Use your own judgment, please, and just don't get us in trouble. They give ballistic missiles to the Houthis, they give drones to the Houthis, knowing full well that their advisors on the ground are making sure that those missiles aren't being used, for lack of a better term, irresponsibly when they're in a showdown with Donald Trump or when they're in a showdown with the United States or when they're in Vienna. So there is a degree of operational control. I totally agree with Bيرني, the Ansarullah are not 12 Shias, they're not followers of wilayat al-faqih in a theological sense, in a religious sense, maybe in a political sense. I mean, the root movement of the Houthi movement, Shabab al-Mu'min, was very much tied to the Islamic Revolution, so they're politically aligned, not theologically aligned. But I think operationally, it's a mistake to discount how much the Iranians have control, at the very least, over Houthi ballistic missiles and Houthi drone operations. What they do on the ground, maybe the Iranians don't control. And there's a parallel also to Hezbollah. I mean, at the end of the day, Hezbollah is Iran's flagship proxy. It's an organ of the Revolutionary Guards to a large degree, but they do have their own interests that sometimes are not, squarely within the Iranian agenda project.
I think, look, I have an anecdote that I think will confirm what you're saying. A couple years ago, maybe 3 years ago now.
Tell me what I'm saying first before you.
Yeah,
because I'm not
which
sure
is that the Houthis are basically a proxy. Of the Iranians.
Just to be clear, my view is that it's bad to assume that they're not.
Yeah.
Right? Because there's a lot of people with certainty that they're not. I don't see any reason to have any of that certainty.
So, I think it was during the Trump administration, the UAE sent a delegation to Iran. And around that time, if I was paying attention, and in fact, I heard the Iranian foreign minister, then Mr. Jawad Zarif, who had visited the UN, and among the things that he, was saying was, wouldn't it be a terrible thing if a major tower in Dubai was hit by a Houthi missile,
Oh, that would be terrible.
right?
Yeah.
It would be terrible.
Yeah, what a shame.
Yes.
Yeah.
It would also be,
Nice little tower you got there.
yeah, and that would, of course, end the whole model of Dubai, right? In terms
Right. One drone could
One drone.
end the model of Dubai.
Absolutely. And Iran would have plausible deniability. It would also, even
It
though
was an errant Houthi missile.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so whether he was confident that the Houthis would do this or not, in the effect was that it had the UAE exactly where the Iranians wanted them, and they came and paid some form of obeisance. I don't have the details of what they did with the Iranians, but it was very clear that the Houthis, could do things for them if they wanted to. Also, when they attacked the Abqaiq and Khurais fields in September of 2019, if you listen to the Iranians then, they said, no, it wasn't us, it was actually the Houthis. When in fact we now know that those launchers
from the
came,
Iraqi-Iranian
came from
border.
the Iraq-Iran border, exactly.
Yeah. Well, I think we should turn to the audience soon for questions, but let's just have, we dealt with two issues here. We dealt with the JCPOA negotiations as a general empowering of Iran, and then the pressure it puts on Saudi Arabia and Yemen. There are a lot of other areas to talk about, but let's just, looking at those two. You're sitting in Riyadh, you're watching this picture. There's no hope, you said, they think, of the U.S. really changing course. So what's the strategy, or at least what's the plan for dealing with this multi-pronged threat to Saudi Arabia?
That's a good question. I think it's worth noting that Saudi Arabia does have luxuries that other Arab countries don't. It has a large military, has a well-equipped military with large defensive capabilities, and it has the financial wherewithal to decide to focus on its own economic development and to say, it's horrible what's happening in Iraq, but we're focusing internally.
Which is kind of what they're doing.
Which is to a large degree what they and other Gulf countries are doing. But I think the
But
question
Mohammed,
we
you
should be
can't
asking,
you can't develop and diversify your economy if your neighborhood
Of
is
course.
so chaotic and constantly threatening, right? So, I mean,
It makes it
I
much more
appreciate
difficult,
that
yeah.
you're doing all this domestically, but it is, the Houthis could
of
really
course,
destabilize.
No, it
everything.
makes that much more difficult. But
Yeah.
the point I'm trying to make is that, this is a problem for countries like Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, much more than it is a problem for Saudi Arabia. And this is something that needs to be talked about. If we were to have, a realistic discussion about the future of Iraq in the short term, the medium term, the long term, will the next generation of Iraqis have a country that is, comparable to other stable states in the region? That's when you have a real problem. That's when, the Iranian expansion project, which is predicated on weak central governments, on proxy militias, on essentially using these states as arenas
And
to fight the
using the
Americans.
violence,
Exactly.
using they're happy to destabilize
Exactly.
if it pushes America back.
Exactly. So I mean, this policy is bad for Saudi Arabia, sure, but what it does for countries like Iraq and Syria and Lebanon and Yemen is condemn them to unprecedented failure for a long time going forward, and that's very bad for those countries.
And,
Yeah,
what is your view on
Yeah, so
what
if I were, going to pretend that I'm sitting in Riyadh, what I see them doing is the following. First of all, there's clearly a view being taken of what countries and matters really matter for Saudi Arabia's strategic interests and which ones don't. Clearly, Lebanon does not anymore, right? So Lebanon is really Europe's problem, it's Israel's problem, it's America's problem, it's not Saudi Arabia's problem. If Lebanon implodes, so what? From the Saudi point of view, I mean, it's sad, of course, but it's not going to strategically affect Saudi Arabia, and that's why we see this rupture that happened. Jordan matters. So I think Jordan will always be on Saudi Arabia's radar.
Because it's a bordering state.
It's a border state. It's the cultures, the peoples are very important. It's just very similar. Yemen matters, right? Internal domestic development, economic development matters. So I think you do see a kind of, and at the same time.
Where's Iraq in this, priority list?
At the same time, what you're doing is you're trying to please the American administration. So you're having discussions and negotiations with the Iranians. Though from what I hear, the Iranians don't really state what they want. They just want to have talks all the time. What they want is essentially just let's reopen embassies, but they don't want to talk about anything else.
Because the Iranians want the dialogue with the Americans. They don't want the dialogue with you.
Right. So, but the Saudis are talking to the Iranians. The Saudis, are desperately, frankly, trying to end the war with the Houthis and have repeatedly made offers, very generous offers to the Houthis. No interest there. And I think the Saudis are doing this other hedging thing, which with the Chinese and buying some equipment from Chinese. A lot of Chinese investments in big infrastructure projects. There's all of that going on. But, essentially you're trying to mitigate and minimize damage from this region that is very chaotic so that you can get on with the project of building up your own society. The one other thing that the Saudis are doing, and this is where the kind of, the Biden people who present, as Muhammad said earlier, that the region is basically forever, a sectarian conflict between Shiites and Sunnis. It's true that the Iranians use sectarianism and have Shiite proxy militias working on their behalf, from Yemen to Iraq to Syria and Lebanon. Saudis are not interested in sectarianism. They've cut off all funding to Islamist movements. In fact, they're fighting Islamist movements everywhere in the world. They've cut off all funding to madrasas, to educational Islamic stuff. Nothing, it's all ended, right? So the Saudis are now operating like a nation with national interests as a state that is not interested in Islam as a political ideology for promoting its interests. That's what the Iranians do. The Saudis are not doing that. And I think that's something that, in fact, undermines the narrative that it's all about sectarianism. And two, it's a very welcome sign, because basically what America should want in the Middle East are countries that operate as states and not operate as sort of Islamic internationalist militia, type movements, and states that foment that kind of ideology and those kinds of operations.
I don't see that having any all of the things that you just described. It wasn't that long ago where I think that would have made a big impact in Washington. I don't see that moving the needle with the Biden administration. I mean, they seem to be, from my perspective, so intent on this dialogue, accommodation with the Iranians that anything that the allies are saying, the Israelis, the Saudis, others, isn't really moving the needle. I just throw that out as a thought. I think we should turn to the audience now and see if any of you have anything that you would like to say.
I want to go back to the Nadia Bilbesi with العربية. I want to go back to the Iran talk. A while ago, the State Department issued a statement clarifying that the Iranians have not come with any constructive proposals in this 7th round of talk. And actually, they have not cooperated even with the IAEA. And they're warning of some kind of crisis. So there's some theories out there or some premise that actually this round of talks is under the new hardline government. And then they will send a delegation to Vienna, but they're not going to negotiate because they've been consistent of saying you have to lift the sanction before we can come back to the deal. And some people believe actually the Iranians will send this delegation, but they're not going to do anything. And meanwhile, they're developing facts on the ground that becomes a bomb, and they will declare to the world that we have it. How plausible is this scenario? And second, when the administration and the Israelis keep saying that it's never going to allow Iran to have the bomb, yet the administration at least saying they shy away from a military option. The Israelis they might give the green light to the Israelis to allow them to assassinate a scientist here and there or to use cyber war. But meanwhile, the Iranians are determined to go ahead with this. I don't know, I'm just throwing these ideas for you to let us know if this is really plausible scenario.
So I think that's an excellent question. Thank you, Nadia. I think the Iranians think their assessment of where the U.S. position is that America has an ironclad commitment to achieving a deal. That there is no other option for the Americans. Whether that's true or not, I think that's not far from the truth. I don't think it's 100% true. Hopefully not, but that's what the Iranians think. I think that's what describes their posture in these talks. On the American side, I think that the assessment of the Iranians is that these are hardliners and they're less easy to deal with than Jawad Zarif, and we just have to work on these negotiations a little bit harder. I don't think that this difference between hardliners and moderates really exists. Khamenei's hold on power is strong. I mean, he decides what the foreign policy of the country is, whether he chooses Qasem Soleimani-like figures to deliver a message or whether he chooses Jawad Zarif-like figures to deliver a message is purely that. It's a choice that he makes. So I think that's the misperception on both sides. I don't know if it's a misperception on the Iranian side, but I'm fairly certain that on the American side, the idea that this is just a hardline government and we need to work extra hard in Vienna to reach a deal with them. And I don't think that's how the dynamic is playing out.
I mean, my only sense is that we're already talking about not the removal of all the sanctions, but just some of the sanctions could be tweaked. And that's probably what the Iranians want to do. They're driving a wedge in that direction. They want some relief. And then once that happens, then the next time round, you can justify more and more and more. And that's what I suspect is their strategy. And my suspicion is that it'll work with this administration.
So this is what Mark Dubowitz from FTD calls less for more. That the U.S. will be getting less and then giving more. But
yeah, it'll seem like it's a deal.
Exactly. So it's little pieces. But it's also important to consider that this is a deal that will expire in 2031. This is a path to give Iran open in 2031. So this conversation is one that we could have more credibly had 7 years ago in 2015. But today, I mean, I don't know if this is the right conversation to be having.
Mm.
First, I have a comment and then a question. I'm really surprised, Mike and Mohammed, the way you describe the Houthis as a proxy of the Iranian regime and describe that the Iranians have their finger on the Houthi button. I mean, isn't this discounting the importance of the very prominent, well-known Houthi rocket scientist community and the very well-established Houthi aeronautical engineering industry? I mean, couldn't that be the reason these missiles are coming out of Yemen? Okay, separately, Supreme Leader is 82. It's an Iranian system that hasn't really had a transition of power before because it was a different system the last time that happened. This guy's been the dictator of Iran for 33 years, purged all opposition. And so what we're seeing is his regional strategy, his grand strategy, his regional national security strategy from Riyadh. But the discussion that I'm hearing coming from you, the points from Mohammed and Bيرني, is as though this is an Iranian regime that is going to be there. It's going to be there as it is for the foreseeable future. Is that truly the view from Riyadh, or can they look 3, 5, 7, 10 years down the road, if that long, and see a potential succession crisis that might change the configuration in Tehran, that might change somehow, for good or ill, Iranian regional strategy?
Mohammed, you want to?
I mean,
a good answer.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for how the Saudis see the inside of the regime in Iran, but from the discussions that I've had and some of the things that I've read, including, for instance, they have a center called Rasana, which is a center that focuses on Iran, and so it's really as close an insight into how Saudis think of Iran as you can get. The
It's a
feeling.
very, very good center.
It is a good center.
Yeah.
The view from there is that the supreme leader will end up anointing or appointing someone who is very much in his, who shares his worldview and shares his strategy, and or the IRGC will eventually take over, and it'll become a sort of like a military style regime with a supreme leader who basically answers to the IRGC. So in either case, it's not likely that the regime will in any way soften. If anything, it'll harden and continue with the existing policies. So I don't think the Saudis think that either the regime will collapse or that it'll moderate.
For us?
Yes, thank you all for a very interesting discussion. We kind of tiptoed around the idea of the similarities between what Saudi Arabia is facing and what Israel is facing, but we really didn't get into the Abrahamic Accords and sort of some of the changes that might be taking place, at least behind the scenes, between Saudi calculus and Israeli calculus, and how might that bring them together. Certainly there are many in this town who believe that one externality of American retrenchment in the region is forcing the allies or compelling the allies to work more closely together. Now, I visit Saudi often, and the last time I was there, I did notice that a change of tone, a more forward-leaning Saudi posture when the question of Israel came up. I'm interested in hearing more about sort of the cost-benefit analysis in Riyadh about a strategic relationship with Israel. Can Israel really come to the aid of Saudi Arabia and help, at least maybe at an intelligence level, at a security level, air defense system? How much does that count versus the political cost of openly associating with Israel? We all know that Saudi Arabia is a leader in the world of Islam, certainly amongst the Arabs, the population, although many young, but still conservative, at least when it comes to this issue. So I'm interested in your thinking about the cost-benefit analysis of a more forward-leaning Saudi Arabia in terms of the Abrahamic Accords.
Great question. Thank you. Mohammed, you want to start?
I think that's a good question. I think it's no secret that there are considerable alignments and interests between Israel and not just Saudi Arabia, but even other Gulf states in terms of how they look at the region's security. And it's also no secret that probably Tel Aviv does not consider Riyadh to be one of its top 20 or even 30 national security threats today, and the same can be said about the Saudis. And also, it's important to note that Saudi Arabia did not oppose the signing of the Abraham Accords with countries like the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and said that this is a sovereign matter, and each state, makes their own calculations based on their assessments of their own sovereign interests. But then that takes us to the point that you mentioned. There is a cost-benefit analysis here, and the reality is that Saudi's historic commitment to the Palestinian cause and its position in the region causes it to require considerable, significant headway on the Palestinian issue, and they've said exactly that. They said they're totally open to normalizing relations with Israel, to stepping up cooperation with Israel, but there has to be an independent Palestinian state.
Yeah, I mean, so my sense of Saudi Arabia on Israel is that I do think there's a genuine difference between King Salman's view on this and the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman's view on this. So I think King Salman is very much of the generation that feels strongly about Palestinian rights and also to some extent the illegitimacy of Israel. I mean, he's very much part of that generation. I think someone like Mohammed bin Salman is much more attuned to his population and how his people feel. You have to remember that 70% of Saudi citizens are under the age of 30. I'm not sure how these youngsters feel about Israel. I suspect that many of them really, the Palestinian issue doesn't resonate as much with them as the older generation does. And so this is all to say that eventually the regime will have a reading of its own people and will be responsive to that reading. If the sense that comes from below is that it's unacceptable, we won't see Saudi Arabia joining the Abraham Accords. If it's not politically problematic, then we're likely to see a move in that direction. But having said all of that, you can have lots of benefits without actually having ever formal diplomatic relations with Israel. Like, for instance, there can be security arrangements, intelligence sharing. El Alf has overflight now over Saudi Arabia. So I think you can have technology transfers, even perhaps certain coordination with military. In the high-tech industry, for instance, I think there are developments in this direction. But an open, formal recognition without, as Muhammad says, genuine, real kind of steps towards the Palestinians and their rights, I find very hard to imagine.
I have some views on this I'm going to express, even though I'm just the moderator here. I think if you look at it from the point of view of the issues that we're talking about here, the Iranian nuclear program and the Iranian position in Yemen, the opportunities for cooperation between Saudi Arabia and Israel that is really going to change the balance with Iran are not that great. So you can imagine intelligence sharing, sending the same message, coordinating messages to Washington and to the Europeans, to others, any number of ways in which they can cooperate. But when it comes to the question, are the Israelis going to commit troops to Yemen to help the Saudis in Yemen? I can't see that. Is Israel going to attack the Iranian nuclear sites, and not sabotage like we saw under the Trump administration, but actually attack? I don't believe they will, if it means going against the Biden administration and calling down on them the wrath of the Biden administration for foiling the effort of the Biden administration to find an accommodation with Iran. And I can't imagine, let's just say that did happen. A lot of people believe it will happen. I'm more skeptical for the reason I just said. But let's just say it did happen. Does Saudi Arabia want to be part of that operation? I don't think so, because it would be sucking itself into a major war with it. Could be potentially sucking itself into a major war with Iran against the will of the Biden administration. So it's already lived through what it's like to fight a war without the support of the Americans in Yemen. It's going to want to start this other war. I don't see that happening. So even if it is pushing them together in certain ways that are not insignificant, I don't see it turning into operational cooperation on the issues that we've been talking about. Ambassador.
You gave me away, Mike.
No, I didn't. There are many ambassadors in town.
First of all, thank you for organizing this, and thank you to Mohammed and Bernard for sharing your perspectives with us. I did want to make one comment and to go back on the issue of the FTO designation for the Houthis, and just to kind of clarify a little bit, I think what the background was. And Truth in Advertising, I was one of the signatories of a letter that about 100 former officials sent to Mike Pompeo before he made the decision, asking him not to do it. And the reason was not because any of us have any particular sympathy or respect for the Houthis. It had nothing to do with them. It did have to do with the fact that the entire international community, including the United Nations, World Food Program, World Health Organization, international NGOs, and everyone else were extremely concerned about the impact that this designation would have on their ability to continue to operate in areas that are under Houthi control. And keeping in mind that about 70% of the Yemeni population lives in areas that are under Houthi control. And not only in terms of the delivery of humanitarian assistance, but even beyond that, even the continuation of commercial relations, keeping in mind that most of the food, most of the other supplies that come into Yemen come in through commercial channels. And if banks are unwilling to extend letters of credit or any other kinds of financial guarantees, then you can't have that kind of commercial traffic. So all of those arguments were the arguments that were made. The reality was that if the Trump administration had been serious about wanting to designate the Houthis, they could have done it in 2017, they could have done it in 2018, they could have done it in 2019. They didn't. They waited until December 2020, after they lost the election and when they had one foot out the door, knowing that the incoming administration disagreed with them about this decision. And therefore, the conclusion can only be, frankly, that the decision to designate was not because of any deep concern about the Houthis. It was, in fact, a poison pill that they were leaving for the incoming administration. Biden really didn't have much choice except to remove the designation, which he did, and the result has been what we've seen. And you know, the points that you made about the FTO and about how it has been interpreted or misinterpreted by the Houthis, et cetera, are exactly right. That's exactly what did happen. The genesis of that, the root cause of that, is not Biden's decision. It was the Trump administration's decision to do this in the first place. And so I did want to make, you know, that point. The question that I have is entirely different, and I think it goes back to the original question, and that was, we've just completed the last round of JCPOA negotiations. What is coming out, the reporting that's coming out of Vienna, is that once again they made no headway. That the Iranians have increased their demands for sanctions relief, and in reverse, have offered even less in terms of what they're willing to do on the nuclear file. I agree with your point that coming in to this year and how the Iranians perceive the Biden administration, that their expectation, not unreasonably, was that the administration would be deeply committed to getting a deal. The reality has been somewhat different. The reality has been that the Biden administration has been a tougher negotiator with them than they anticipated, and that in fact the Biden administration at least has appeared to be willing to walk away with no deal. And so my question to you is, if there is at least a 50-50 chance that this negotiation will end without an agreement, where do you think and how do you think that the region will interpret that? What will that suggest to them in terms of U.S. position? Does that bring them closer to the United States? Does it mean that, for example, they look to the United States and maybe by extension Israel for greater security cooperation and a deeper military relationship, keeping in mind that at least the Emiratis in the past have thrown out this idea of actually trying to achieve a NATO-like security guarantee from the United States, which isn't, it's not practical in the U.S. political situation, but nevertheless they've put that out as a possibility. So do they come back to that, or conversely, do they see this as a requirement for them to perhaps find their own way to reduce tensions with Iran and try to isolate regional interests from what's happening in the larger international context of JCPOA and the nuclear file?
Go ahead.
Go ahead. That's That's a big question. I think the issue here at its core is one where Gulf states are in front of two very difficult choices. If and before I say this, just to make a comment on the Biden administration's position right now, the position is very clear. Let's just go back to the JCPOA as it is exactly, but the Iranians have to walk back from everything that they did recently. That's a deal, and for the Iranians, that's an excellent deal. They're playing hardball because, again, they think that the Americans are committed. They're not leaving the room without a deal, and if your adversary is not leaving the room without a deal, why not get a better one? So they can choose to stop this as soon as they feel that they're pressured. They're too pressured. They'll accept. They'll walk back and they'll go back to the JCPOA. They want sanctions to be lifted first. They're trying to maximize their position. But for the Gulf states, I think you're between a rock and a hard place. If these negotiations fail, then the risk of military escalation in the region rises, and you have a security problem and a potential nuclear bomb that the Iranians have. But if this deal goes through, then you know for sure that you'll have one in 2031. But you'll also know that up until 2031, you're going to have an IRGC that has the financial power to double down on its regional proxy network, knowing full well that this is one of the major sources of Iranian leverage alongside the threat of acquiring a nuclear weapon. There are no good options. And that's why I think there was a lot of support for the idea of maximum pressure on the Iranian regime. Because while in Europe perhaps or in Washington it's viewed as a tactic or a tool to get Iran to the negotiating table, for actors in the region, including Israel, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, it had intrinsic value. I mean, it deprived the regime of the resources it needs to fund the cells that attack these countries. So there's no real good answer, I think. But one of the main flaws of this deal is that it gives Iran a clear path to a nuclear bomb. It's just telling Iran, wait, and while you wait, we'll pay you handsomely.
Yeah, my sense is that they would be very surprised. The regional players will be very surprised if the Biden administration actually says no deal at all. And my suspicion, if that hypothetical situation, I think there will be renewed respect for the administration. That this is an administration that's not simply transactional, but that has some spine and principles, and they will certainly try to think of how to then protect themselves from Iran that may or may not become more aggressive. I mean, I think a no deal outcome doesn't necessarily mean a more aggressive Iran. It might, in fact, mean an Iran that is perhaps less aggressive. I'm not sure.
I'm once again going to give my view on this,
Please.
Which is that I dispute the premise that the Biden administration is being a tougher negotiator than anyone. That the absence of a deal means the Biden administration is being a tougher negotiator, because there's been an enormous amount of unofficial sanctions relief that they have been giving in the form of actually releasing money, but also the not enforcing other sanctions. I mean, Chinese purchases of Iranian oil are through the roof. The United States isn't trying to do anything to stop that. So I think if the deal ends, I mean, if the negotiations end and the Americans say we have no choice but to put very, very significant financial pressure on the Iranians, that's one thing. But if it ends and there's this informal sanctions relief, from an Iranian point of view, that's as good as the deal. And that's that's where I think we're headed. We're headed to no deal, which means there's a quiet understanding that Iran will keep your stockpiles at level X, and we won't touch any of your trade with China or with this actor, or with that actor. It's a kind of unofficial JCPOA where the Iranians always have the leverage over us. That allows the Biden administration to then go around and say in Congress, well, we didn't lift the sanctions. No, formally you didn't, but in practice you did. No. I've been watching this issue for a long time. Okay, I think we'll stop there. Thank you for what's been thank you two for what's been a very interesting and engaging conversation, and thanks to all of you for your questions and your comments. And without further ado, say goodbye.